The Quebec sovereignty movement is a political movement as well as an ideology of values, concepts and ideas that advocates independence for the Canadian province of Quebec. Several diverse political groups coalesced in the late 1960s in the formation of the Parti Québécois, a provincial political party. Since 1968, the party has appealed for constitutional negotiations on the matter of provincial sovereignty, in addition to holding two provincial referendums on the matter. The first, which occurred in 1980, asked whether Quebecers wished to open constitutional negotiations with the federal government for the intended purpose of establishing a sovereignty association pact between the province of Quebec and the rest of Canada. Approximately 60% of Quebec's voting public rejected the idea put forth by Parti Québécois' leader René Lévesque. The matter was dropped by the party for most of the 1980s, especially after the patriation of the Canadian Constitution without the consent of the Parti Québécois' government, and the creation of the Federal Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which enshrined the protection of the French language and French-Canadian culture in Canada. In 1995, after two failed attempts by the Mulroney government to secure Quebec's ratification of amendments to the Constitution, the Parti Québécois held a second referendum, though on this occasion the question was, albeit obliquely asked, whether one wished for the independence of the province of Quebec from the rest of Canada. The response was again in the negative, though this time by a far closer margin, with a mere 50.58% against the proposal. Though the Parti Québécois has long spearheaded the sovereignty movement, they are not alone. Other minority provincial political parties, such as Option Nationale and Quebec Solidaire, also support sovereignty, but are not always supportive of the Parti Québécois. The Quebec Liberal Party, Quebec's other primary political party, is opposed to increasing political sovereignty for the province, but has also been historically at odds, on occasion, with various Canadian federal governments. Thus, Quebec politics is effectively divided into two camps, principally opposed over the sovereignty issue. Quebec sovereignty is politically opposed to the competing ideology of Canadian federalism. Most groups within this movement seek to gain independence through peaceful means, using negotiation-based diplomatic intervention, although fringe groups have advocated and used violent means. The overwhelming number of casualties were murdered at the hands of the FLQ, a terrorist organization which perpetrated a bombing and armed robbery campaign from 1963 to 1970, culminating in the October crisis and the death of senior government minister Pierre Laporte. Since this time, all mainstream sovereignist groups have sworn off violence, while extremist nationalist groups, though in the minority, support violent actions in the name of liberating Quebec from Canadian sovereignty. The primary mainstream political vehicle for the movement is the Parti Québécois, which has governed Quebec on multiple occasions. In 2012 it was elected to a minority government, in which its leader, Pauline Marois, became the first female premier of Quebec. However, only 18 months later, the PQ was defeated by the Liberal Party of Quebec in the 2014 elections. Terminology. In practice, separatist and sovereignist are terms used to describe individuals wanting the province of Quebec to separate from Canada to become a country of its own. Supporters of the movement generally prefer the latter term. The term independentist is preferred by some of these supporters. Reasons for sovereignty. Justifications for Quebec sovereignty are historically ethno-nationalistic in tendency. claiming that the unique culture and French-speaking majority are threatened with assimilation by either the rest of Canada or, as in metropolitan France, by Anglophone culture more generally, and that the best way to preserve language, identity and culture is via the creation of an independent political entity. Other distinguishing factors, such as religious differences, are also used to justify either separation or ethno-nationalist social policies advocated by the Parti Québécois. The historical justification is that Quebec should be independent by virtue of New France having been conquered by the British in 1763 and subsequently relinquished to the British in exchange for Guadeloupe. It argues that the people of Quebec are the descendants of a conquered people who are due to the national sovereignty. This perspective was popular in the 1950s and 1960s when European countries were giving up the colonies in the name of independence throughout much of Africa, the Middle East and South Asia. 8 of the other Canadian provinces are overwhelmingly English-speaking, while New Brunswick is officially bilingual and about one-third francophone. Another rationale is based on resentment of anti-Quebec sentiment. With regard to the creation of the sovereignist movement, language issues were but a substratum of larger cultural, social and political differences. Many scholars point to historical events as framing the cause for ongoing support for sovereignty in Quebec, while more contemporary politicians may point to the aftermath of more recent developments like the Canada Act of 1982, the Meech Lake Accord of the Charlottetown Accord. Many supporters of Quebec sovereignty often compare the situation with Catalonia in regards to Spain and Tibet in regards to the People's Republic of China. Overview. Background. Tension between the Francophone, Catholic population of Quebec and the largely Anglophone, Protestant population of the rest of Canada has been a central theme of Canadian history, shaping the early territorial and cultural divisions of the country that persist to this day. Supporters of sovereignty for Quebec believe that the current relationship between Quebec and the rest of Canada does not reflect Quebec's best social, political and economic development interests. Moreover, many subscribe to the notion that without appropriately recognizing that the people of Quebec are culturally distinct, Quebec will remain chronically disadvantaged in favor of the English-Canadian majority. There is also the question of whether the French language can survive within the geographic boundaries of Quebec and where French-Canadian society and culture fits into what is an increasingly multicultural country. Separatists and independentists are generally opposed to some aspects of the federal system in Canada and do not believe it can be reformed in a way that could satisfy the needs of Quebec's French-speaking majority. A key component in the argument in favor of overt political independence is that new legislation and a new system of governance could best secure the future development of modern Quebecois culture. Additionally, there is wide-ranging debate about defense, monetary policy, currency, international trade and relations after independence, and whether a renewed federalism would give political recognition to the Quebec nation could satisfy the historic disparities between these cultural nations and create a more cohesive and egalitarian Canada. Several attempts at reforming the federal system in Canada have thus far failed because of, particularly, the conflicting interests between Quebec's representatives and the other provincial governments' representatives. There is also a degree of resistance throughout Quebec and the rest of Canada to reopening a constitutional debate, in part because of the nature of these failures, not all of which were the result simply of sovereignists and federalists not getting along. To cite one case in a recent round of constitutional reform, Elijah Harper, an Aboriginal leader from Manitoba, was able to prevent ratification of the agreement in the provincial legislature, arguing that the accord did not address the interests of Canada's Aboriginal population. This was a move to recognize that other provinces represent distinct cultural entities, such as the Aboriginal population in Canada's prairies of the people of Newfoundland. Contemporary politics. Perhaps the most significant basis of support for Quebec's sovereignty movement lies in more recent political events. For practical purposes, many political pundits use the political career and efforts of René Lévesque as a marker for the beginnings of what is now considered the contemporary movement, although more broadly accepted consensus appears on the contemporary movement finding its origins in a period called the Quiet Revolution. René Lévesque, architect of the first referendum on sovereignty, claimed a willingness to work for change in the Canadian framework after the Federalist victory in the referendum of 1980. This approach was dubbed le beau risque, and it led to many ministers of the Lévesque's government to resign in protest. The 1982 patriation of the Canadian Constitution did not solve the issue in the point of view of the majority of sovereignists. The constitutional amendment of 1982 was agreed to by representatives from 9 of the 10 provinces. Nonetheless, the Constitution is integral to the political and legal systems used in Quebec. There are numerous possible reasons the Yeses campaign went down to defeat. The economy of Quebec suffered measurably following the election of the sovereignist party Quebec.Several and continued during the course of the campaign. The Canadian dollar lost much of its value, and during coverage of the dollar's recovery against U.S. currency, there were repeated citations of the referendum and political instability caused by it cited as cause for the fall. Some suggest there were promises of constitutional reform to address outstanding political issues between the province and the federal government, both before and since. Without any sign of particularly greater expectation those promises would be filled to any greater or lesser degree. There remains no conclusive evidence that the sovereignty movement derives significant support today because of anything that was promised back in the 1970s. Proponents of the sovereignty movement sometimes suggest that many people in Quebec feel bad for believing the constitutional promises that the federal government and Pierre Trudeau made just before the 1980 Quebec referendum. Those were not delivered on paper or agreed upon in principle by the federal government to the other provincial governments. But one conclusion that appears to be universal is that one event in particular, dubbed the Night of Long Knives, energized the sovereignist movement. During the 1980s, this event involved a backroom deal struck between Trudeau, representing the federal government, and all of the other provinces, save Quebec. It was here that Trudeau was able to gain agreement on the content of the constitutional amendment, while the separatist Premier René Lévesque was left out. And it may well be that a certain number of Quebecers did and may even now feel bad both about the nature of the deal and how Trudeau went about reaching it, regardless of Quebec government's refusal to approve the 1982 constitutional amendment because the promised reforms were not implemented. The amendment went into effect. To many in Quebec, the 1982 constitutional amendment without Quebec's approval is still viewed as a historic political wound. The debate still occasionally rages within the province about the best way to heal the rift, and the sovereignty movement derives some degree of support from a belief that healing should take the form of separation from Canada. I also criticized the unilateral repatriation of 1982, concluding that, even in the moments of greatest mistrust, the Quebec never imagined that the Pact of 1867 could ever be changed without their consent. Hence the impression they had in 1982 of a breach of trust, of a violation of the national bond's integrity. The descendants of George-Étienne Cartier did not expect this from the descendants of John A. Macdonald. Perceived as trickery in Quebec, the repatriation of 1982 has placed a time bomb in the political dynamics of this country. The failure of the Meech Lake Accord, an abortive attempt to address the above issues, strengthened the conviction of most sovereignist politicians, and led many federalist ones to place little hope in the prospect of a federal constitutional reform that would satisfy Quebec's purported historical demands. These include a constitutional recognition that Quebecers constitute a distinct society, as well as a larger degree of independence of the province towards federal policy. In Montreal, June 25, I walked along Rue Sherbrooke to Olympic Stadium, submerged in the immense river of white and blue that seemed unstoppable on its march to sovereignty. 3 days earlier, Bourassa, former Minister of Federalism, had hurriedly changed his tune. English Canada misunderstand that. Quebec is, today and forever, a distinct society, free and able to assume its destiny and its development. The contemporary sovereignty movement is thought to have originated from the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, although the desire for an independent or autonomous French-Canadian state has periodically arisen throughout Quebec's history, notably during the 1837 Lower Canada Rebellion. Part of Quebec's continued historical desire for sovereignty is caused by Quebecers' perception of a singular English-speaking voice and identity that is dominant within the parameters of Canadian identity. For a majority of Quebec politicians, whether sovereignist or not, the problem of Quebec's political status is considered unresolved to this day. Although Quebec independence is a political question, cultural concerns are also at the root of the desire for independence. The central cultural argument of the sovereignists is that only sovereignty can adequately ensure the survival of the French language in North America, allowing Quebecers to establish the nationality, preserve their cultural identity, and keep the collective memory alive. At the same time, a brutal gesture by the Saskatchewan legislature brought the first language crises to my doorstep. The legislature precipitously abrogated the only law guaranteeing linguistic rights to the French population. It was revenge for a recent Supreme Court decision that had confirmed the constraining power of the law requiring all provincial laws to be available in French. To avoid having to translate all the laws, Grant Devine's government moved to repeal the act. The French community reacted with indignation and asked for federal intervention. Legal and constitutional issues. It has been argued by Jeremy Weber and Robert Andrew Young that, as the office is the core of authority in the province, the secession of Quebec from Confederation would first require the abolition or transformation of the post of Lieutenant Governor of Quebec. Such an amendment to the Constitution of Canada could not be achieved without, according to Section 41 of the Constitution Act 1982, the approval of the federal Parliament and all other provincial legislatures in Canada. Others, such as J. Woerling, however, have claimed that the legislative process towards Quebec's independence would not require any prior change to the viceregal post. Young also concluded that the lieutenant governor could refuse royal assent to a bill that proposed to put an unclear question on sovereignty to referendum or was based on the results of a referendum that asks such a question. Arguments against sovereignty. In a series of letters throughout the 1990s, Stéphane Dion laid out an argument against sovereignty. It has also been argued by prominent Quebecers that sovereignty politics has distracted Quebecers from the real economic problems of Quebec, and that sovereignty by itself cannot solve those problems. In 2005 they published the position statement pour Québec lucide, which details the problems facing Quebec. Many Federalists oppose the Quebec sovereignty movement for economic and political reasons, but many also oppose sovereignty on other grounds. For example, since the 1995 referendum in regards to the declaration of Quebecers who blamed the loss on money in the ethnic vote, many Federalists considered the sovereignty movement as an expression of ethnic nationalism. Some arguments against sovereignty claim that the movement is illegitimate because of its Eurocentrism, which alienates many among Canada's First Nations, as well as the Inuit and Inuit peoples and the sympathizers. The sentiment is summed up by a quotation from a Mohawk from Axon. How can Quebec, with no economic base and no land base, ask to become sovereign? How can Quebec be a nation when they have no constitution? We have had a constitution since before the American Revolution. Quote. Here the argument expresses a claim that the Mohawk Nation has a more legitimate claim to distinct nationhood on the basis of traditional lands, and a constitution predating Confederation, and thus should be afforded the right of self-determination. Similarly, the Cree have also asserted for many years that they are a separate people with the right to self-determination recognized under international law. They argue that no annexation of them or their territory to an independent Quebec should take place without their consent, and that if Quebec has the right to leave Canada, then the Cree people have the right to choose to keep the territory in Canada. Cree arguments generally do not claim the right to secede from Canada. Rather, the Cree see themselves as a people bound to Canada by treaty, and as citizens of Canada. The Cree have stated that a unilateral declaration of independence by Quebec would be a violation of fundamental principles of human rights, democracy and consent. If secession were to proceed, the Cree argue that they would seek protection through the Canadian courts as well as asserting Cree jurisdiction over its people and lands. Professor Peter Russell has said of Aboriginal peoples in Canada, are not nations that can be yanked out of Canada against their will by a provincial majority. With few exceptions, wish to enjoy the right to self-government within Canada, not within a sovereign Quebec. International human rights expert Erica Irene Diaz says the change will leave the most marginalized and excluded of all the world's peoples without a legal, peaceful weapon to press for genuine democracy. Quote. This concern is connected to the claim that if Quebec were to be considered its own autonomous nation-state, then it need not honor the treaties and agreements that were formed between Aboriginal peoples and the British and French monarchies and is now maintained by the federal Canadian government. Concern for this may stem from perception of neo-colonial or Eurocentric attitudes in the leadership of former premiers, such as Robert Bourassa and self-proclaimed conqueror of the North. Additionally, those in favor Canadian federalism denounce Quebec separation as a balkanization of Canada.